expected of you, it becomes pretty easy to do that, since the same kinds of problems come up again and again. Just to start off, I'm going to hand out an overview of the IB syllabus for people starting the 2011-2015 syllabus. So this class is going to be focused at people taking, if you look down here at the options, option 3 for paper 2, people studying the origins and development of authoritarian and single-party states. It's also good for students studying option 5 for Cold War. It's a bit of overlap. We're going to focus on Cold War ideology and the single-party state USSR, led by Stalin in the period we're considering. So I have a few other handouts as well. I'll give out periodically. First of all, we're going to start by considering a fairly common type of essay question. It's a question that requires students to look at essentially two sides of a popular debate. This one is the extent to which differences in ideology sparked the Cold War. We're going to do this by looking at just one side of the argument in this class, which is that yes, ideological differences did cause the Cold War. So I'm handing out some stuff that you're going to use like a bit later. So you'll see there's lots of empty boxes for now, but yeah, you're going to fill those in eventually. So the point of this class essentially is to make sure that, first of all, if this type of essay question that's on the back of that sheet comes up, you'll understand what's expected of you, and also you'll know most of the knowledge that's required for at least one side of the argument. It's going to take more than one lesson to teach you both sides of the argument. So to begin, I'm just going to board up some of the content with your help, and we're going to make sure that we're on the same page regarding exactly what the ideological differences between the US and USSR were at this time. Do any of you have a background in this already? Just so I know. Okay. Or like some interest. So?
We'll do our best.
Okay. At this stage, most students will have studied like the core tenets of Marxist ideology, Marxist-Leninism. Also, democratic capitalism should be familiar to them, like as a concept, as an economic model. So they'd be able to give me some content if I were to ask them questions, but I'd have to fill in a lot of the blanks, and that might be the case right now as well. Let's just get a table up. So on the left-hand side here, I'm going to have Marxist-Leninism. I'll try communism before to be simple, but yeah, either's fine. And then over here we'll have democratic capitalism. So we're going to focus primarily on 4 different aspects of society: economics, civil rights, religion, and government. Let's go from the top down. If there's anything that we don't cover on the first sweep down the board, we can fill in any blanks later. If we start with economics, does anyone have some understanding of perhaps the major methods for managing economics in a communist state? Typically, generally. It can be in fairly like broad terms.
A lot of state-owned things.
Sure. Yeah.
Like
yeah. Exactly.
land.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. In fact, I write up centrally planned economy to begin with. I'm not going to break the board up into sections, but you'll know where to add them. So yeah, essentially planned economy, often also known as a nationalized economy. Any idea why they might have preferred this style of economics?
More equitable distribution.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. There's a massive ideological background there. So the communists really tried to push the idea that if they didn't themselves take control of the distribution of resources in society and the allocation of jobs, then inevitable class exploitation would lead to the division of society into two unequal classes, something that they'd tried to reverse in Russia 1918 revolutions, or 1917 and 1918 revolutions. So yeah, essentially planned economy, nationalised government, a nationalised economy. I think something to focus on also is the idea of like very, like as you suggested, very carefully planned stages in their economic policy. So like 5-year plans, a massive part of their economic policy. So everyone in the country constantly working towards a common goal, like a unified approach to economics. How about in the US and the Western world, in the democratic capitalist world? How might you define their economic way of doing things?
Laissez-faire.
Sure, yeah, laissez-faire is a great term there. So what do you mean by laissez-faire exactly?
Free markets.
Some regulation.
Yeah, but the underlying principle there behind laissez-faire, like what's the idea in terms of this like more hands-off approach to economic theory? What's the expected outcome of that, if you can?
Natural, I guess, supply and demand, just kind of equalizing things. But I don't know if it's equalizing as much as, I mean, I'm not a big economist.
Yeah,
so.
I suppose we could think of the idea of like the like social Darwinian idea of like survival of the fittest. It's natural that the stronger people in society will thrive if given freedom, and as a result, the country will thrive because unless like the strongest people are allowed to realize their potential, the economy doesn't really utilize its resources, i.e., the people.
So
yeah.
Call the ideological background of that then some kind of natural selection.
There's definitely a social Darwinist like natural selection element there. Yeah, like the idea, for example, of eugenics, even though it had been tarnished in World War II, was still like a fundamental part of intellectual movements in Europe and the USA throughout the early 20th century. So there was an element of like eugenicist or like social Darwinist, like survival of the fittest thought in policymakers' decisions. So yeah, laissez-faire economics, this idea of like free markets, this idea of profit as incentive, whereas profit was seen as evil in the communist world for driving competition, driving exploitation. In the capitalist world, it was considered to be the major driving force behind innovation and behind progress. So these are some of the major differences here, ideologically, in terms of economics. Can you think of anything to add before we move over to civil rights? Sure.
Obviously, it's debatable whether or not this is true, but I
Okay,
think
no problem.
there's the social Darwin aspect, but there's also this idea of a rising tide lifts all
Sure.
boats. So,
Okay. Can you elaborate somewhat in terms of like how that might have applied to just like everyday people?
So trickle down economics is
Yeah.
the other term.
Yeah.
Basically, so it's not just that if you allow the fittest to thrive, that they will be successful.
Right.
But their success in turn raises the productivity or livelihood of those under them.
So the success of the few elevates society as a whole then? Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we've got clear contrast here. We'll talk more about race and rich, they contrast later on in the class, but certainly there's no real common ground in terms of economics. I'm going to erase this. Everyone okay with me erasing this now? Okay. So what do you think I mean by civil rights here?
Like human rights?
Sure, okay. For example,
It could go a lot of ways. So we
yeah,
could
yeah.
look at, like,
But
voting,
some of like the
voting
major ones that are
rights,
typically
Ability to
like
voice.
advocated.
like freedom of speech type
Yeah,
thing.
speech.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So yeah, basically like agency on a basic level, the freedom to do things in society, to move freely, to speak freely, to participate in society. And again, clear differences here. Should we start with the communist world? Maybe someone can throw an idea up here for us to start with.
You can speak as long as the government lets you. I don't
Absolutely,
know.
no, that's great. Yeah, so like overt censorship. Then, so not only in public, in everyday speech, but in the press, in academia, only accepted messages were allowed to be expressed in any form in the
Some
Soviet Union.
ideas are obviously seen as a threat.
Absolutely,
to
yeah.
the system itself.
Can you think of maybe what kind of ideas might be considered?
Can't agree.
Sorry.
Free market, he said.
Yeah, credit capitalism.
Absolutely, yeah. Any of the ideas that are going to be on the right hand side,
Yeah.
more or less, yeah.
Disallowed.
Okay, so still up censorship. Remember that was in several arenas, not just the public sphere. Okay, so that kind of goes hand in hand with limited freedom of speech, doesn't it? Can you think of maybe some other forms of expression that might have been limited? We've got a few there already.
Religion?
Yeah, okay. We'll go into that in more detail, but absolutely, religion
Oh,
was.
sorry, I didn't see
No,
that.
no problem.
Participation in the government, maybe?
Yeah, that as well. We'll get onto that with
Sorry.
government. So we've got all races covered. But yeah, absolutely. Like, I was thinking more in terms of like art and culture, like state-approved
There
plays.
was a lot of propaganda, right? There
Yeah.
was sort of the nationalistic film or the nationalistic poster.
Absolutely. So yeah, not only were messages censored, but messages were also clearly, yeah, absolutely. So I'll throw propaganda up here as well. That could be considered like outside of these four categories in some ways, but it's definitely got overlap. How about on the right hand side here? So
Supposedly freedom of speech and freedom of
yeah, we're gonna have to use like qualifying terms there, like relatively, I think probably. So yeah, relatively free speech.
Do we differentiate between things that are controlled by government and things that are controlled by just social norms?
Here we do, because we're talking about systems of government, the systems of power. Like obviously, yeah, there are like more subtle forms of like filtering, but yeah, we're not really talking about that here. So relative freedom of speech. How about in terms of how people participate in society? Because obviously they can't. So yeah, broad insofar as yeah, like really anything will do. I'm just thinking of ways in which maybe people are able to influence the progress of their local communities, policy, artistic movements, anything really.
You can pretty much go to whatever school you can get into and afford. You can pursue whatever career you want.
Okay, I think that freedom of movement is important. Like people are free to study abroad, they're free to access foreign ideas, something that was much harder for the USSR or people in the USSR. If someone from Stalin's Russia were to travel to say France, like the centre of the Enlightenment earlier, to study and then return to the USSR, they'd immediately be suspected to have picked up like dangerous foreign ideas. So yeah, definitely freedom of movement over here. Let's say this obviously has a link to government. But let's say like freedom to vote, like suffrage was a major civil right that people in the democratic capitalist world enjoyed. And then we have like a lack of censorship relatively in press, academia, and so on. Obviously, things like communist messages were somewhat censored, especially like during the McCarthyism era. Yeah, and still now arguably like some messages are like promoted or like discouraged, but there is definitely that like undeniable relative freedom of all of these messages. Anything else for civil rights before we move on to religion?
So we include things that help as a right, or
I'd leave that out of a table like this for like major differences. Both the communist world and the democratic capitalist world argued that healthcare is important. Obviously, it was supposed to be state provided in the communist world. In reality, that didn't really happen. I'll add it up in terms of like theory. There was in Soviet Russia, people were supposed to be able to, even if you're in like a village, go to a local doctor. But partly because people were so farly spread apart, and partly because the intellectual class, which included doctors, had been purged, that was rarely actually possible. So let's say access to state resources.
Would that include like education as well?
Like education was supposed to be provided. It wasn't always provided, and obviously if it was provided, it was like a very like specific education. But in theory, yeah. Like They definitely, especially 20 years previously, when a lot of the ideas they promoted were relatively new, they definitely did aim to make progress in terms of like women's rights and in terms of like dismantling class privilege. They failed overall, as we'll see in later classes, but they did have that intention. Remember, the people who took control in Russia in the October Revolution were simply intellectuals. They didn't have any government experience. They didn't have an informed idea of what their job would involve. So although they went in with the best of intentions, arguably, they were rarely realised.